Hello and welcome again to History Now. Joining me today is Dr. Brian Hanley. Brian has been on the show a couple of times before. In fact, he's the third-time guest on History Now. Brian will be here today to talk about his latest piece of research, which is in the current edition of Irish Historical Studies, and it is on Irish republicanism, anti-Semitism in the post-World War era. Brian, you're very welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on for a third time. So Brian, your current piece of research, which as I mentioned, is in the latest Irish Historical Studies journal. It's a really fascinating look at anti-Semitism in a particular time period. But what I want to ask you first is, given that we're seeing themes of anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination in current politics on a world level, did that factor into your thinking when you were writing this and researching it?
I mean, I suppose you always do to some extent, but I was kind of drawn to it in that I was looking at the Irish Revolution in its global context, and you couldn't, in the post-war world, 1918 and so on, what's called the Jewish question is really inescapable. It's everywhere. So I was fascinated to see how it turned up in Ireland. I mean, I was just the other day looking at British intelligence reports from July 1919, and Basil Thompson, who was one of the senior intelligence figures in the British military, was just stated boldly that Bolshevism, it's been established, is an international movement organised by Jews. So the great and the good believe this. Winston Churchill in 1920 writes a famous article in the Times where he talks about the role of Russian Jews and so on in Bolshevism and anarchism and in revolution worldwide. He's drawing on the theories of a woman called Nesta Webster, who was a conspiracy theorist who most of the time would be regarded as a complete crank, but yet he takes these views very seriously at that time. So we're not talking about a fringe view in 1918, 1919. Now, post-Second World War, post-Holocaust, people are generally much more sensitive about the subject of anti-Semitism. So sometimes people would be surprised at what is said in day-to-day discourse in 1918, 1919, in what the newspapers say, what politicians say, and so on. So you do have to be aware of that people are view this differently because of the horrific experience of the 20th century. But certainly there's a same sense of crisis, the same sense that this crisis can't be explained rationally, that there are unseen forces at work. And that really is a global phenomenon at the time. Today you have that spreading much more rapidly through the use of modern technology. It spreads pretty rapidly in 1918 and 1919 as well, when you see the similar arguments raised in the United States, across Asia, in Australia, and so on too. So yeah, I mean, I obviously was aware of it, but I'm also keen to say that you're looking at a particular historical period too.
So Brian, your article, your research begins with a letter from Count Plunkett to Eamon de Valera, and as I was reading it, you get the sense of these are things that you're hearing quite often today in online discourse and in news reports. There's a lot of similarities going on. Could you give us a bit of an idea of the tone of that letter between Plunkett and de Valera?
Yeah, I started with that document because Plunkett was, he was the first separatist abstentionist MP elected in 1917. He was the father of 1916 martyr Joseph Mary Plunkett. Some of his other sons were involved in the IRA at quite a high level in the years after. And he's serving in the Dáil cabinet in 1919, 1920. Now, in other ways, Plunkett mightn't be that representative of a character because he's a very wealthy Dublin Catholic aristocrat, in some senses. But he writes to de Valera and he's lobbying actually for the creation of a fine art museum and so on. But in the midst of this, he has a long diatribe about why Irish Republicans should avoid contact, if possible, with what he just refers to as the Jews. And Plunkett's themes are essentially that the Jews are an international race, that they have corrupted and dominated most of the countries of Europe, that the Jews and the Freemasons together had been responsible for the First World War, that they are responsible for pornography, they're responsible for the anti-Irish nature of the press in Britain, that their capitalists are sweaters, that their immigrants from Eastern Europe are troublesome, and so on, interspersed with, there are individual Jews who are fine people, who are, artistic and cultured and so on, and some of the German Jews are naturalized and they're, okay. But it really combines both traditional Christian hostility to Jews with more modern themes. The only one that it doesn't really feature is that idea of the Jews as responsible for Bolshevism. And what I kind of argue in the article is that that idea didn't really appeal to Irish Republicans in 1920 or 1921 because they were seen as part of this conspiracy too. So the people who tended to believe in Britain that the Jews were behind the Bolshevik Revolution also believed the Jews were behind the Irish Revolution. So it didn't make much sense for Irish revolutionaries to buy into elements of that. Some of them did later on after the treaty, but not in 1920. So Plunkett really expounds on a whole series of what were very common beliefs about the Jews. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a reply from De Valera, but I just thought it was a useful place to start in terms of trying to analyse these attitudes within Ireland.
Could we perhaps now just get a sense of what the Jewish community in Ireland at this time at the turn of the century going into the revolutionary period, what that community was like? I know in recent years, there's been a number of scholars looking at them on regional levels. David Toms has been looking at them in the context of Waterford, and Donald Fallon in a recent Three Castles Burning podcast looked at the Jewish community in Dublin. Could you give us a sense of who they were, what they were engaged with, and the size of the community?
Yeah, again, I suppose the important point of the article was that whereas when you look at Irish Republican attitudes towards race and other things, you're often talking about the Irish abroad. But the point about attitudes towards Jews was that there was a Jewish community in Ireland itself. Now, people always say it was very small. It was, but there were about 5,000 Jews in Ireland during the revolutionary period, but they were by far the largest ethnic minority and certainly the by far the largest non-Christian minority. And if you lived in Dublin in 1920, between the two canals, shall we say, you would have been aware of Jews. They would have been visible, in a way that they aren't today, for example, in a much larger Dublin and a much smaller Jewish community. But Jews were visible, and they were also visible across Ireland because there were Jewish presences in Waterford, as you say, in Cork, in Belfast, in Limerick, and so on. And also Jews travelled. Some of them were peddlers and so on, or travelling salesmen. So the idea of Jews was quite a common one. Now, again, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I have to say that people like Natalie Wynne, Sean Gannon, Peter Hesse, and the people you mentioned are all doing a lot of new cutting-edge work on the Jews in Ireland itself. And the actual Jewish community, I suppose, weren't the main focus of what I was doing. I was looking more at attitudes towards them and about them. But it's important for people to remember, and again, we do this with the horrible experience of a century behind us in which we know what happened. Ireland's population had been in decline throughout the 1800s, fallen drastically after the famine. The Jews start to come here, Jewish people start to come here in numbers in the 1880s, 1890s. So they're coming in when lots of Irish people are leaving. And you'll see lots of discourse in newspapers of a variety of types, all about Ireland has been overrun by Jews, overrun by immigrants. Now, when you look at the figures, you go, how could anybody think that? But that's not the way the world works. You can have virulent anti-Semitism in societies where there's no Jews. So Jews are immigrants. They're not Christian. There's centuries of Christian hostility to Jews, which Irish Catholics and Protestants share to greater or lesser extent. And they also, the Jewish community, it's centred in Dublin, but it exists elsewhere. A lot of them are involved in tailoring or in furniture and so on. So they're seen as rivals. So in the Labour press, you will see hostility towards Jews as Jews. Jews seen as sweaters, seen as bad employers, Jewish workers seen as likely to work for less than Christians and so on. You will also see that religious tension. You've got the events in Limerick in 1904, for example, which, again, we forget Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, so a boycott of the Jews in a city in the United Kingdom is big news. So this is discussed at Westminster. The local Home Rule MP defends the reputation of his city, as people from Limerick tend to do, and says that there's nothing wrong here, that the people are defending themselves from exploitation. Catholic Church are heavily involved and so on. So this is quite a big story at the time. And a lot of ideas about disease, about immorality, about shady dealings and so on would be associated in the public mind with Jews. By the early 1900s, you have a term in Dublin, Jewman, which is a fairly uniquely Irish term, Dublin term for Jews. And that's used up to the present day still by older people about moneylenders, for example. So this is all part of the discourse that's going on at the time.
It's really interesting what you look at in terms of Irish newspapers and over what would become the Irish border. You see different newspapers from, say, Belfast and Dublin attacking the Jewish community and attacking Jews in general, but for very different reasons. Could you give us a sense of that?
Yeah, well, there's a commonplace run-of-the-mill anti-Semitism, as there is with racism, in which language which would not be used today is used regularly. So the mainstream press, including the Unionist Irish Times or the Nationalist Freeman's Journal and so on, would have printed jokes in inverted commas about Jews, which would be unacceptable today. But in political terms, what you begin to see by 1918, 1919 is the idea of the Jewish Bolshevik, the Jews as central to this idea of communist revolution, beginning to be reflected in the press in Ireland. So newspapers like the Tuam Herald, for example, praise Henry Ford in the United States, of course, of Irish extraction. Ford funds the distribution of versions of the protocols of the Elders of Zion conspiracy theory about the Jews. He runs a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, which every week, attacks Jews as being behind communism and being behind all these other dangers. The Tuam Herald, for example, reprints excerpts from that, talks about the Jews wanting to destroy Poland because she's a Catholic nation. At the same time, the British far right are convinced, and not just the far right. Again, sometimes when you look at the fringes, people say, well, these people are mad, who listen to them. But conservatives more generally would have taken on board aspects of what the far right were arguing. So the idea that the Jews are involved in the trouble in Ireland as well is reflected in books like The Cause of the World Unrest, which is published by the Morning Post, which is a right-wing newspaper in Britain. And the Belfast newsletter reviews that favourably. In the Belfast newsletter, you see speeches at Orange events, for example, where they'll talk about the Spanish Jew, meaning De Valera. And the idea that De Valera is Jewish or half Jewish is a very, very common one at the time across different political circles, and gains a revival post 1932 when De Valera is in power. And De Valera makes a speech to Dáil Éireann in 1934, which is about him not being Jewish. And this is quite, phenomenal when you think about it, because certainly you look at a lot of Fine Gael meetings in the 1930s locally across the Free State, and people will refer to De Valera as a foreigner and often suggests that he's Jewish. So this idea is around, but it comes originally, certainly in Britain, from the far right. It's taken up by unionists. And sometimes there's a sense among British conservatives, the so-called diehards, that the Irish would never have got round to having a rebellion themselves. There has to be an outside influence. And Cecil Bretherton writes a book, The Real Ireland. He argues, the ball was set rolling in 1916, as it is everywhere, by the international Jew. So there's this sense that the Jews have to be involved. Conservatives and right-wingers, think that they're involved, and they'll find evidence. Simon Greenspun, who's a Jewish trade unionist involved in the engineering strike in Belfast in 1919, is held up as evidence that, of course, the Jews are behind this. And you do have, in the United States and Britain and so on, people who adhere to these theories. And then in Ireland itself, you've got both nationalists and unionists who, for different reasons, have suspicions about Jews.
Another interesting theme in that, and it's something I've come across before, and that's the question of Irish people taking different sides, opposing sides in international conflicts. In your research article, you look at Arthur Griffiths, and in relation to the Boer War and what he sees as a Jewish conspiracy in relation to the war in South Africa. Could you give us a sense of what was going on there?
Yeah, I think a lot of the time with Irish republicanism or separatism, if Britain is fighting somebody, the Republicans are naturally on the other side. and they either don't look too closely or don't care about what the politics of the other side can be. Now, there was widespread enthusiasm in nationalist Ireland for the Boers, and there was a lot of opposition in Britain to the Boer War as well. And Griffith is by far from the only person who argued that the motivating factor in the war was essentially Jewish merchants and businessmen in Johannesburg and elsewhere. And he'd lived there, and there had been, Jewish emigration into South Africa, and he sees them as central. Now, there are elements on the British left who argue that as well, and there's really interesting studies about how socialists in Britain had used Jew as a disparaging term, and it would never fail to point out the Jewishness of a capitalist, for example, if they were Jewish. And that begins to change because of Jewish socialists and because of those in the labour movement who argued that this is really, a form of racism that actually divides the working class. So you do see that in Ireland too, but Griffith certainly wouldn't have been alone in thinking that or arguing that, and that fed into his politics on this question more generally. The Boer War is really interesting because there's all these other questions about race too, which are important. But I mean, I should say that this is kind of so widespread. I was struck just recently. I was looking at Maurice Manning's book on the blue shirts again, which came out in 1970. So we'll say it's before a lot of archival stuff. But he argues that the blue shirts weren't anti-Semitic, which is not true. But he says they weren't. And why would they be? Because there's very few Jews in Ireland, and there was really no anti-Semitism anyway. Now, you can't look at newspapers in Ireland in the 1920s and 1930s and not find anti-Semitism. Yeah. It's not that it's the driving force of Irish society. It's not that it's the mobilising force of most Irish politics, but it's very, very widespread, and it's taken for granted. You've got to see it, I think, also in a wider context about how widespread anti-Semitism was and how it could be used in all kinds of contradictory ways to explain all kinds of problems.
So there's a really interesting theme that you touch on in your article, and that is the influence Zionism has on cultural and political nationalism in Ireland. I want to talk about that, but before that, could we talk about, one of Griffith's contemporaries of that, for want of a better term, that rising generation, and that is James Connolly. Connolly stands out somewhat in that in some of his election materials, his election literature, he has it translated into Yiddish. What do you think that tells us about the period, and in particular, James Connolly?
I mean, Connolly's newspaper, The Workers' Republic, would have carried some of this very contradictory material. He'd have republished articles from the Australian Labour press, which blamed the Jews for the Boer War. At the same time, he'd have also republished articles which praised Zionism, talked about a new Jewish homeland being built in Palestine, for example. And within Dublin, the Jewish community is quite different, for example, from much larger communities in the United States or in Britain. Jewish community in Ireland didn't have a very large working class, but there were Jewish workers in Dublin, usually concentrated in tailoring and furniture making and so on. And when Connolly stood for election in the early 1900s, he appealed to them directly in a leaflet in Yiddish, which was written, I think, by members of the left in the East End of London. So again, Connolly does, reject racism. He does argue for Jewish workers uniting with their Irish co-workers and so on, which again does stand out. But he's an exceptional individual in many ways. But unfortunately, I mean, when you look at newspapers like the Irish Worker, Jim Larkin's newspaper, prior to the First World War, for example, I mean, the very first edition and the second edition carries the same kind of anti-Jewish joke, which reflects Larkin to the extent that Larkin could not have an argument with somebody without pointing out what was obvious about them or using it against them. And I think that changes after his time in America, for example. I think he comes into contact with far more Jewish people and with the Jewish left and so on, and later on in life he defends Jews against anti-Semitism. But this is an immensely kind of contradictory, period. Yeah. And it's a kind of pervasive prejudice that you find relatively few people standing up and being absolutely opposed to any expression of anti-Semitism. Even people like Michael Davitt, denounces the pogroms in Eastern Europe, publicizes them, and is, highly regarded by the Jewish community because of that. But in other circumstances expresses what would be, anti-Semitic views as well.
And if we could now perhaps talk about what we'd mentioned there previously, and that was the influence which Zionism had on Irish cultural and political nationalism. How did that play out?
Well, people like Ave de Blackham, who's a Sinn Féin intellectual, and around 1919, 1920, he publishes a couple of books on what Irish Republicans stand for and so on, which he's probably not very well known today, but at the time is one of the people who's really trying to put the Sinn Féin revolution into a kind of a intellectual perspective, drawn on communism and Bolshevism, but putting it in an Irish context, very much often a Christian context or a Catholic context as well. But he'd be one of the people who would have written in the Sinn Féin press about how positive Zionism was, for example, and how, he says Israel means the triumph of Sinn Féin, that the Jews have they're developing a language, Hebrew, which will unite them all, even though it isn't widely used at all at the time. They're developing a movement for a homeland, and they're going to do this despite all the persecution they've suffered across the world. And really, this is something positive. And, this is something we should emulate. And Griffith buys into that as well to an extent. And this is why there's been recent debates about this. Colm Kenny, I think, rightly points out that Griffith is singled out for anti-Semitism where it's ignored in other historical figures at the time. But where I think he's wrong is that he argues that really Griffith became a Zionist anyway, which meant that he was no longer an anti-Semite. You can be a Zionist and an anti-Semite. There are Christian Zionists who believe Zionism is a good thing because it means all the Jews go away somewhere else. And Griffith really kind of says that the honest Jews are Zionists because they want to build a homeland, but the ones we have across the world aren't honest. So, he combines both an admiration for Zionism as a movement and also personal or political anti-Semitism. But yeah, it does. And you find that later on as well. Irish language revivalists, for example, would have said, people claim that we can't revive Irish, but the Jews were able to revive Hebrew, which they didn't really speak at all, until after the establishment of Israel. That's a crude kind of version of the argument, but you do have within Irish nationalism both anti-Semitism, but also an admiration for Zionism too. And by the 1940s, you do have Republicans who, because there's guerrilla warfare in Palestine, who think that the Irgun and the Stern Gang and all that are legitimate liberation forces, and they're fighting the British and they're emulating us, which to some extent they actually did, because they'd looked at the Irish situation and what the IRA had done too.
Brian, could we now talk about a bit about the Jewish community at the time of revolution? Because there are one or two incidences of members of the Irish Jewish community who won't go on to play a prominent role in nationalist politics and in the revolutionary period. But in terms of the wider scope of the Jewish community, what was their relationship with the Irish Revolution? Did some collaborate? Did they keep their head down? It seems to me a very complex picture.
Yeah, I suppose, again, the controversial aspect of this might be that when you talk about Jews in Ireland and the revolutionary period, people like Robert Briscoe are singled out. Robert Briscoe is from Dublin. He was Jewish. He's involved in gun running for the IRA, and he later becomes he's a very strong supporter of De Valera, later Lord Mayor of Dublin. And he's really held up as an example when in many ways he's quite an extraordinary character. I mean, the Jewish community in Ireland came to the United Kingdom from Eastern Europe and from the Russian Empire, where they'd faced intense persecution. And people sometimes forget that certainly before the First World War, Jews in the United Kingdom thought that it was a pretty good place that had taken them in. So lots of Irish Jews are unionist politically, and again, more research probably needs to be done in Belfast, for example, and Derry and political attitudes there. But in Dublin, there would have been Jews who would have socialised with Protestants and unionists far more quickly than they socialised with Catholics and nationalists. And that's kind of not talked about now because it's messy and complex. Similarly, there were people in the British administration who were of Jewish extraction. Not all of them were Jewish. They usually, their families had possibly become Anglican or so on over the decades. But where they're there, it's usually pointed out by their opponents, that these Jews are there. There's Jews in the British military, which is natural enough. Thousands of Jews fight in the First World War. Some of them come to Ireland as British soldiers. Some of them are black and tans or auxiliaries as well. So there are Jews involved in nationalism. I suppose Plunkett's interesting because when Plunkett gives his long letter to De Valera about why you shouldn't trust Jews, he does end by saying that in Dublin, the Jews are sympathetic indeed, you know, friendly to us. So which would suggest that a lot of people in the Jewish community were sympathetic towards Sinn Féin. And there's evidence of that in witness statements and so on of individual Jews sheltering IRA people on the run, hiding weapons, contributing to Sinn Féin election funds. And you do have a number who are involved. Now, again, this is the subject of these different trends in popular culture. One which wants to celebrate this and say that loads of Irish Jews were Republicans, and one which wants to argue that, you know, effectively Ireland is hiding this anti-Semitic past and is trying to pretend that really, you know, Jews were more involved than they were. I mean, the truth is much more mixed, but there are probably other stories as well, but they're much harder to get to the bottom of. So it's a community, I think, that's small, is very aware of its vulnerability and doesn't know how this is going to turn out, and therefore would have been wary of getting involved in too much politics a lot of the time. Individuals do on both sides, and others trod an uneasy line. But I think there's a sense within the Jewish community that really we don't know what's going to happen here, because across Europe, the breakup of the old empires creates tremendous possibilities. There's the birth of republics across Eastern Europe and so on. But at the same time, this is accompanied by this new wave of anti-Semitism.
Brian, thank you very much. It's a really, really fascinating piece of research. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, it has really strong echoes of what's going on today in terms of anti-Semitism or bigotry in a wider sense. Just if you could tell us now what's next for you, what are you working on, and what's going on in general?
Well, I suppose this is part of a kind of an attempt to look at the Irish Revolution in a global context, which lots of people are doing, thankfully. But again, I was struck by how once the Irish go outside Ireland, and I suppose this is where this is an interesting subject, that in Britain and to a much greater extent in the United States, the Jews and the Irish are part of diasporas. Mm-hmm. And in the United States in particular, following the First World War, there's this wave of nativism, there's a Red Scare, there's the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, who are anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, as well as obviously being anti-Black and so on. And that during the revolutionary period, Irish Republicans in the US often find themselves working alongside Jews. So despite tension over lots of issues, there's also lots of cooperation. So you'll find, for example, that the Irish Race Convention in 1919 is addressed by Zionists, for example. The Jewish left, socialists and so on in New York are involved in Irish relief efforts, involved in support for the Irish Revolution. When Muriel McSweeney and Mary McSweeney come in the winter of 1920, many of the great rallies in support of McSweeney's hunger strike are chaired by Jewish activists or sometimes by religious figures, rabbis. And the Irish press in the United States, like the Irish World and so on, they fairly consistently refer to the fact that a lot of the money that's been subscribed to the Dáil loan, obviously most of it's coming from Irish people or Irish Americans, but lots of it is coming from other ethnic groups, and the Jews are very prominent, probably the most prominent among them in terms of their willingness to subscribe to the Dáil loan and associate themselves with this call for Irish independence. So there's also a story here, not just of anti-Semitism, but also of cooperation. And you find that at a subterranean level too, in terms of gun running and so on in Britain. You've got Jews in the East End of London who are actually criminals, many of them, who are involved in gun running alongside the IRA. So you've got what I think is a fascinating story, which isn't just about the Irish and the Jews, but it's about the global nature of this whole phenomenon.
So Brian, thanks very much again for coming on the show. I'm really delighted that you took the time out to speak to me today. Thank you.
A pleasure.